Hello and welcome to the ProjectWise Administrator Advanced Accreditation course on Enhanced Environments. This is part 2 of a two-part series for the Document Code section of the course covering document code restrictions. In this section of the course, the use and maintenance of ProjectWise document code restrictions will be reviewed. The benefits of using document code restrictions is to limit, prevent, and reserve the use of serial number ranges for document types based on their document code parts. This also extends the ability to group documents by serial number. During this course, you will learn the inputs for the document code restriction tool, the types and uses of document code restrictions, the administration of user-created document code restrictions. Now let's look at the document code restrictions tool you'll be using. First, it's accessible from the environment node by right-clicking the document code restrictions and creating a new restriction. If you already have restrictions created, on the right panel, it will display all document code restrictions for that environment. When creating a restriction, new restrictions applied at the time do not impact existing documents, meaning documents that already have serial numbers assigned to their document code will not be impacted unless the document code is edited. All new documents will be impacted after a restriction has been created. The properties to collect in the restriction dialog for creating a new restriction are, first, the description. The description should be very informative to allow the ProjectWise administration team to understand its purpose. Next is selecting the type of restriction, which could be allowed, forbidden, or reserved, and these will be covered later in the course. Then the code combination that this restriction refers to must be entered. There are no wildcards or leaving entries blank do not mean any value. When creating a restriction, specific values have to be entered. Last is the lower and upper range that this restriction will apply. It is the serial number, upper and lower range, and the logic is the serial number greater than or equal to the lower number, and is the serial number less than or equal to the upper number. Now let's go over document code restrictions, terms, and types. First, we mentioned earlier the description for the restriction, and we mentioned to use informative descriptions. For instance, in this example, the description identifies that for this specific project, these two restrictions are set. One is an allow and the other is a forbidden. But we identify the purpose. And by default, the restriction dialog will show the code and the upper and lower limits. Some terms I'll be using in this course is specific code combinations. When referring to this, we're meaning all values entered for each document code part. So the section of the dialog where you enter the project originator, area, zone, type, and level, this is called the specific code combination. Again, there are no wildcards supported, so multiple entries will have to be created to support all the variations of document code combinations. You'll notice also the dialog only displays the table column names, not the friendly names, as you would see in the document creation wizard. The other term I'll use is range of serial numbers, which is simply the lower and upper numbers the restriction applies to. Notice that in the dialog, by default, the number zeros are populated for the lower and upper range. Zeros are not accepted. Values must be 1 or more. The lower and upper serial number can be the same number, but highly unlikely you would use that technique. Now the restriction types, and you would choose the allowed, forbidden, or reserved. One thing to note is once a restriction has been created, it cannot be edited afterwards. The only option to edit is the description. To edit a pre-existing or newly created restriction, it must be recreated from scratch and the old one deleted. Now let's look at the allowed restrictions. An allowed restriction limits the use of a range of serial numbers for a specific code combination. Every possible combination allowed must be entered. An error is generated if the entered code combination by the user does not match at least one allowed restriction. This is the most restrictive rule because once you create one allowed rule, that will impact all combinations entered by users, meaning all non-matching code combinations cannot use any range unless allowed. For example, this allowed combination allows the use of serial numbers 1 through 1000 that matches the code combination P202134 underscore MCO underscore D underscore RD underscore 3DM underscore ZZ. Once this is applied, ProjectWise will not allow any document to be created in this environment that does not match this code. To allow for other documents to be created with different code combinations, every possible combination must be entered. Now let's look at forbidden restrictions. Forbidden restrictions prevents specific code combinations from being assigned to a range of serial numbers. This overrules allowed and reserved restrictions. An error is generated if a code is entered and the serial number matches the restriction. Earlier, we mentioned that the allowed will generate an error if the code combination did not match. As an example, we have a forbidden restriction that forbids the use of serial numbers 100 through 250, overriding the previously created 1 through 1000 that was allowed. We entered the same code combination that we entered previously. So now users can create documents between the numbers 1 and 99 and 251 to 1000. But cannot use numbers between 100 and 250. Let's look at reserve restrictions. Reserve sets aside a specific range of serial numbers to be only used for specific code combinations. The range must be allowed before it can be reserved. An error is generated if the serial number falls within the range specified in the reserve restriction and the code does not match the restriction. Or an error is generated if the range is not allowed using an allowed restriction. As an example, we have a reserve restriction that reserves serial numbers 600 through 750. And again, we put the same code combination, which means only documents created with this code combination can have a serial number 600 through 750. Now let's look at user reservations. In ProjectWise Explorer, users can reserve serial numbers for document code combinations using the attributes document code reservation command. They will enter the upper and lower range and the specific code to be applied to that reservation. These reserved serial number ranges are seen in ProjectWise Administrator. For example, a user has created the expected documents from XYZ, entered the code, and reserved serial numbers 450 through 500. As previously mentioned, a reservation can only be created if the user has been allowed to use those serial numbers. Users should remember to delete any unused reservations. In the example, the user reserved 50 documents. If they received only 40 they should remember to remove the reservation so other users could use the remaining serial numbers. However, this often doesn't happen, but the ProjectWise Administrator can go in and remove those reservations. Now that we know the types of restrictions, we're going to go into ProjectWise Administrator and create document code restriction. The first thing we'll do is we'll navigate to the My Company environment in ProjectWise Administrator, and we'll create these document code restrictions in the table. After creating code restrictions, to test the restrictions, it has to be done through ProjectWise Explorer using the Advanced Document Creation Wizard or by editing an existing document code through the Attribute menu. Now let's go into ProjectWise Administrator and add these document code restrictions. In ProjectWise Administrator, I've logged in, navigate to the Environments, My Company, and Document Code Restriction. In the right panel, you'll see pre-existing restrictions. In this case, we see a user has created a reserve type from ProjectWise Explorer for this code combination and between the serial range. We want to remove this, highlight, and delete. And we will create the 4 restrictions from the table. First, right-click, choose New Restriction. The first restriction we want to create is to allow MCO 2D models. We enter the description, choose Allow, enter the code parts, enter the lower range of 1 and the upper range 600. Click Apply, and now you can see that this is no longer editable. So if we wanted to make any changes, we have to delete it and recreate it. Click OK. Let's click and choose to create a new one. Now we are going to allow DOT 2D models, and they will be allowed to create documents between 1 and 600. So we have 2 allow statements. In this environment, the only documents that can be created are documents that will enter the document codes of these 2 combinations. Any other variation will generate an error message saying it is not allowed. Even if the document code is entered and the user specifies to use a serial number outside this range, it still will generate an error. So what we've done is we've only allowed the company MCO and DOT to generate 2D models between these ranges, and that's the only documents that can be created with a document code. Now let's create a new range that will be forbidden. For new restriction, enter forbid MCO 2D models. Choose the restriction type of forbidden, enter the code in the table, enter the range 200 for lower and 300 for upper, and OK. This forbidden restriction will prevent the MCO company from creating documents with serial numbers 200 to 300. This is a technique to subdivide a larger range. Earlier, we gave MCO a range to allow them from 1 to 600. Now we have a requirement where range 200 to 300 will be reserved for a different purpose. Now let's create the last restriction. This restriction will be a reserve DOT 2D models. It's a reserve. Enter the document code in the table. The low range will be 50 and the upper range is 100. Hit OK. For this restriction, what we've done is reserve serial numbers 50 through 100 for the DOT for their 2D models. Reason we're doing that is because we've allowed the DOT and MCO the same range, 1 through 600. However, we have a requirement where only the DOT can use 50 through 100. This is a method to subdivide the allows and reserve specific codes within those range. Now this completes the creation of the restrictions in the table. Let's test this in ProjectWise Explorer. We've logged into ProjectWise Explorer and we're on a test folder that is assigned to the My Company environment. Let's create a new document using the Advanced Wizard. We'll enter the code definition for MCO, drainage, roads, 2DM, and the church road. If we generate, we immediately get a 2, which is the next available number. This was successful because we gave the MCO 2D models access to serial numbers 1 through 600. Let's change 2DM to 3DM. Generate, yes. And we get an error message because this document code combination has not been given allow access to any sequence number or serial number. Let's reset this back to 2. Let's try to generate a number from 250 to 275. Click generate, and yes, you get an error message that is not possible. The reason is because of the forbid restriction that we added, where MCO 2D models are not allowed to be created between serial numbers 200 and 300. This concludes the last part of Enhanced Environments for Document Code, covering document code restrictions. Let's review what has been learned. You've learned the inputs for the document code restriction tool, the types and uses of document code restrictions, the administration of user-created document code restrictions. The next section of ProjectWise Administrator Advanced Accreditation course will be a 4-part series covering attribute exchange.
If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. If you want to see more such series, consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you, and see you next time.